Hello there, all of my new React developers. In this quick video, what I'm going to talk about is the relationship between a data provider and a component that uses the data from that provider to render the HTML representations of the raw data. So right now in the code editor, all I have open are two components: an animal list, which will be displaying HTML representation of the animal, and the animal provider. So the animal provider, just like you did in vanilla JavaScript, is going to be responsible for maintaining the data, including going and getting from an API and pulling into application state. But the mechanism by which you will get this data to be used by other components, the syntax is slightly different. And I'm going to talk about some of the commonalities in what you're used to writing and how it looks now in React. So you'll see in this component right here, here's the provider component. It starts on line 5, goes all the way down here to line 21. So it's got a function here called getAnimals. It's just a regular JavaScript function, just like you were using in your providers in vanilla JavaScript. So that doesn't change at all. But here on line 6, it does change. You're used to having in the first line of code in a data provider is setting up the initial state, which is an empty array. The code was much simpler in vanilla JavaScript. Start off as an empty array, go get the animals. When that comes back, reset this variable to the new array. Well, in React, because React manages state for you, and there's a lot of going on behind the scenes with virtual DOM and diffing the DOM and making sure that only the right things get updated, all kinds of things that we really aren't going to dig too deeply into. But React manages the DOM for you based off of changes in the state of your data. So that's why the next line of code here on line 7 looks more complex. So this animals variable right here serves the same purpose as it did back in vanilla JavaScript. And the default value we now actually have to put over here as the argument that we send to what's called the state hook. And that's built right into React. You can see the import right up here. We can't ever modify animals directly ourselves the way we could in vanilla JavaScript. We have to use this second return value from useState to do it. That is actually a function. What we're providing right here is just a variable. This variable is going to hold a function whose job it is to change the state of this variable. I'm going to say that again because this is confusing for most people. When you invoke the state hook, it gives us back an array. The first thing in that array is the default value that we specified as input. So this animal's variable's original value is going to be an empty array. The second thing that useState gives us back in its response is a function. That function's single responsibility is to change the value of this variable. And all we're doing is storing that function inside of this variable. Now you'll notice that in front of getAnimals, you were used to doing this. If another module wanted to use anything inside of your data provider, you had to export it. Well, in React, you export these things a little bit different, and it's not an actual export. What we're actually exporting from this module is the context and the provider. These two things work in conjunction to allow other components to get access to the data that is maintaining right here, right? That's where the actual state of the data that we grab from the API is going to be stored. So look down here on this line of code. This is how you are letting other components know what they can access inside of the provider. And right now they can access either the getAnimals function or they can access the state variable. Now I'm going to show you how to do this in another component that actually wants to use this data. So the first thing you need to do is, you'll see here on line 1, you need to make sure that you import the useContext hook from React. The next thing you need to do is make sure that you import the context from the provider module, which is this one right here. We're not importing the provider, we're importing the context. Then we take that context and we send it as an argument to the useContext hook. That allows us to gain access to this or this, right? Because this is one object right here. That's really what it's exposing, is an object with those two keys on it. And now in animal list, I've got an object and I'm deconstructing the object. And I actually want both of those things. I want the state and I want the function to get all of the animals from the API. Now, the next line of code is a useEffect hook. A useEffect hook, in a broad sense, is the new way to listen for custom events that you've been doing in vanilla JavaScript. Now, the syntax in React is very different. A lot of it is encapsulated inside of this useEffect hook. They abstract a lot of the complexity in the syntax of custom hooks away from you. So I'm going to explain the syntax here to see how this works. So we're setting up a useEffect hook. It takes two arguments. The first one is a function containing some logic that should run. The second argument is an array of things that we're observing that if the value of anything inside this array changes, is when this function will run. Well, right now, this array of observable items is absolutely empty, which means that the only time that our callback function right here will run is when this component is first initialized or first invoked. And it will never run again because there's nothing in this array, where there's nothing we're listening for. So when this component first gets invoked or initialized, what are we doing? Well, we're invoking the getAnimals function that we got from the provider. And that will go out to the API. It'll pull into application state, and that will change the value of this variable right here, which we're extracting from the provider. That's where the actual data gets stored. So the state of animals is changing. I'm going to put another effect hook in here, and this is just for visualization purposes to understand how the React render cycle works. You'll see that the effect hook is slightly different and is non-functional. All we're doing is console logging inside this effect hook. But the observable array actually now has something in it. We're going to observe if the actual animal data changes. When does the animal data change? And in React is kind of funny because it actually changes twice. The first time that the animal state changes is when we set it up right here. Because we're setting the state as an empty array. All right, so creation is considered a change in state. So that's the first time that that state changes. So in React, we will actually see this console log, and this console log will be an empty array because a state change happened. Now, after this component initializes and we invoke getAnimals, and we get the data from the API and we pull it into the application state, again, the state of animals changes. So we'll see a second run of this function, and we'll see two more console logs. And this time, the animals array will actually have something inside of it. You're used to doing all of this through dispatching custom events. React is doing that behind the scenes for you. You're listening for those custom events with this very unclear and vague syntax. And it's going to be confusing for a while. You just have to know that useEffect takes two arguments, and that the second one has to be an array, and the things inside of that array are variables whose value you're watching to see if it changes. You just have to know it, and that just comes with practice. So two state changes happen. Now in React, every time state changes, this JSX renders. So the first state change is when our animal array gets initialized as a blank array. So this will actually run. It'll render a div with nothing inside of it because the array is blank. This animals.map, which is iterating the array, and since there's nothing in the array, nothing else gets generated. So it's just a blank div on initialization. Then when we kick off the getAnimals, state change happens again. It'll now actually have some data inside of it, which means all of this JSX will then be reevaluated again. But now, since there is something inside of the array, this map array method will start iterating it, and it will generate this HTML representation of the animals inside of that array. So I'm going to go to the browser so you can see this in action. So I'm just going to refresh the page here. We're already looking at the animal list. I'll refresh so we can see those console logs actually happen. We're going to see a console log first that we're going to render with no data. Then we're going to see that the state of the animal data changed with a blank array. Then we're going to see another state change with the actual data this time. So I'm going to refresh now, and we will see those console logs. There we go. Initial rendering of the component, or initialization. No data yet. We haven't actually given the instruction to go get the data yet. But the state is initialized as a blank array, so that's why we see animal state has changed. Blank array. Then the fetch call resolves, the data comes back, state is updated in the provider, state has changed, and then we console. And there we see the actual animal array that came back in the response gets console logged. So back here in the code, I'm going to put in some comments to help you maybe make a transition from the code you were writing in vanilla JavaScript to how it looks in React, so you can kind of see them side by side. So this first effect hook, which I said is initialization. Well, this is the code that you were writing before in your components. So const animal list. So you see it looks just like line 5, right? We're setting up a function to be a component. Then you would invoke get animals, you would chain a then, you would extract the animals from the provider, you would send that array to a render function, and it would put it on the DOM. This is exactly what's happening on line 19 through 22, except the render happens for you. You don't have to specify a render function. All you have to do is what is returned from this component. Here's where you're saying what the HTML representation should look like, and React will invoke a render-like function for you. And we don't have to write this line of code either. We don't have to extract the data from the provider the way you used to. Here's how we're doing it now. This is actually where you're extracting the state from the provider. Now, this second effect hook is where you were listening to state change events that were dispatched by your provider before. It would look like this. So when a provider would go get the data, it would parse the data and it would dispatch this custom event. And then in your component, you would have added a listener on the event hub for that state change. And again, you'd extract the data and either console log it or you'd render it, whatever. So we're still doing the same thing, except it is now this syntax. We're still listening for the fact that the state changed right here inside this array. Completely different syntax. It's actually less clear until you practice enough and you realize that the purpose of that array is to do this right here. The two are functionally equivalent. Instead of writing out clearly that you're listening for a state change event, you actually put a variable inside of this array to listen for changes to that data. So I hope this video helped to make the transition from how you've been writing JavaScript so far for these components and how to get the data rendered by pulling the data in from the provider and converting it to HTML, and how the useEffect hook, a rough equivalent to component initialization and custom events for handling state change.